Larry Kornhoff from the Ms. Suffragette project with the University of Alberta Faculty of Law. Today I have the extreme pleasure to interview the Right Honourable Kim Campbell, former Prime Minister of Canada. She's the founding principal for the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta, and we're lucky to have you here during this semester when we're running this project. The reason we're doing Ms. Suffragette this semester is that it celebrates the centenary of women's voting rights in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. How do you think it's important for us to recount the history of women's suffrage? And what does this mean to demonstrate that women in positions of power, firstly, are capable, and secondly, are absolutely necessary in our society?
Well, it's interesting, this year, 2016, I've actually been to Winnipeg to do some talking, to give a couple of talks to celebrate their centenary, because they were the first.
Yes.
Then I'll be in Saskatchewan in a few weeks to celebrate theirs, and then I'm going to, I think, be the Lieutenant Governor of the Girls Model Parliament here in Edmonton to help celebrate the Alberta centenary. And what is interesting is if you look back 100 years to 1916, what was going on? Well, World War I. And it was one of those occasions where women had to step in on a massive scale to do the jobs that men would normally have done when men went overseas. And what it did is it demonstrated very clearly the capacity of women, and how ridiculous it was for women not to have the vote, not to have the opportunity to participate in decisions that affected them in society. Now we go back, I mean, Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, felt that women should have the vote and thought there was no doubt that women would have the vote and that they would play an important role. But every once in a while you get kind of a combination of factors which pushes things, and in this case it certainly was World War I which demonstrated beyond a doubt, and it just undermined the justice of excluding women from this. So I think it's very useful for us to look back. And what's really interesting was to look at the kind of campaigns that women raised and waged, and also that they were supported by a lot of men as well. It wasn't something that they were always just at loggerheads with men. But when you look at some of the pushback that women got, the kind of condescension, the presumption that leadership and the running of the country or the running of the province, that governance was a male thing, was still pretty heavily rooted. And so I think when we see these attitudes reemerge in a slightly different form, but where we see this kind of pushback against women doing things that people think really ought to be done by men, it's very important to be reminded that that's always been the case, it's always been the challenge. But it's interesting, going back even hundreds of years and thousands of years, that there have been times in human civilization where women were much more equal, where women did have power, women were able to own property, women were able to, for example, take their husbands' estates and administer them and do things like this. It varied from country to country. There is a museum in Rome in the Borghese Gardens called the Villa Giulia, which is a museum of Etruscan art. And the Etruscans were the people in Italy sort of before the Romans. I think there's overlap between them, but the Etruscans were the civilization before Rome in Italy. And when the Greeks came to Italy and encountered the Etruscans, they were shocked because the Greeks were quite misogynist. And the Greeks were quite horrified by the way that Etruscan women were equal. And this museum is quite wonderful because it's full of wonderful art and lots of very naughty things going on Greek vases. But one of the central exhibitions of this museum, and we're talking about well before the Common Era, so we're many years BC, there is a tomb lid. And on the tomb lid are sculptures or statues of a man and a woman, a husband and wife, in a very equal and loving pose. And why that is so interesting is it represents the companionate marriage model of Etruscan society. In other words, this sense of them being a husband and wife, equals, affectionate, not the wife being subservient. So throughout human history, there are things that we discover that make it clear that women being suppressed and women not having a chance to participate is not necessarily natural. But that there are many forces which have changed that, particularly patriarchy, property, the concern, of inheritance and being sure who your children were and all that kind of stuff. That always worked out badly for women because they became the tools of that kind of assurance. So I think it is important when we see those milestones, as we have in Canada, where women getting the suffrage and conquering those particular prejudices and condescension, etc., to remind ourselves that these are struggles that women have gone throughout human history, although even in days before it was about the vote.
Yes.
And that therefore we should celebrate those men and women who worked to create that, the strength of those women, what they were prepared to put up with, because they were often accused of being, not real women and all these kinds of terrible things. But also to understand that these challenges don't necessarily go away. We try to entrench them, we try to make them strongly rooted in our culture, we protect them with the law to be autonomous people in our society. So we celebrate the strength and the delight and the character and the good sense of humor which many of these women had, because my goodness, if you didn't have a sense of humor, you'd have been in a padded cell. But the fact that when women demonstrate without a doubt their capacity to carry these burdens, it helps to push society forward. But that we should never take it for granted.
Thank you. And in the fall of 2014, both CTV News and CBC Radio aired different interviews, but similar interview with you, where you discussed your idea for electoral reform to guarantee gender parity in the House of Commons. And of course, this is a hot topic right now with our brand new cabinet. So your idea was obviously met with some opposition at times, and I've heard people, and again, there were men who supported women in the suffrage movement, and so it's not just a binary gender discussion.
It's women and men who get it, working to persuade women and men who don't get it, is what it is.
Absolutely. So I've heard detractors say that Mr. Trudeau's decision is an inappropriate reflection of the members of Parliament elected by Canadians, and that if voters wanted equal representation of women in politics, then more women should run for office and more women should win elections. So in light of your experience as the Prime Minister and as Cabinet Ministers, notably Minister of Justice, and that we're here to talk about women and their capacity in positions of power, what are your thoughts on this new cabinet?
Well, first of all, there have often been cabinets that were disproportionately men, even when there were women in the House, not very many. Pauline Jewett, who was a member of Parliament a Liberal member of Parliament when Lester Pearson was Prime Minister. I think she later went on to become an NDP member of Parliament. But anyway, she used to tell the story of talking to her mother about how she was enjoying being an MP, and that she felt that she was, ready for greater responsibilities and challenges. And her mother said, well, you should go and talk to Mr. Pearson. So she went to talk to the Prime Minister, and she said, she felt that she was ready to take on some greater challenges and be very interested in going to cabinet. And the Prime Minister said, but Pauline, we already have a woman in the cabinet. You'd have a token woman, and so the idea was that cabinet would be dominated by men. And I should say that even in the current cabinet, most of the heavy-duty portfolios are held by men.
Interesting.
Justice is held by a woman, and I was the first woman Minister of Justice, and the current woman is the third and the first First Nations, and that's really great.
Yes.
But finance, foreign affairs, a lot of those heavy-duty portfolios are still held by men. I'd like to see a woman finance minister. Defense, I was the first woman defense minister in Canada, and so far the only one. So just the fact that you have numbers doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing the most heavy-duty or most important jobs. I wouldn't say that they're not, but there are some portfolios that are still pretty underpopulated by women. So the question is, should the Prime Minister appoint 50% of his cabinet as women when 50% of his caucus is not women, or 50% of it is not women? Well, these are all decisions that are the Prime Minister's to make, and there are a lot of things that go into creating a cabinet. You'd like to think it's because you're brilliant and clever, but regional concerns are
Of
very
course.
important. Background, the Prime Minister has been trying to balance a number of things. I lived in Spain when Prime Minister Zapatero was elected unexpectedly, and during the campaign he promised to create a cabinet that was 50% women. This was back in 2005. He got elected, and 50% of his cabinet were women. Or in fact, it was back in 2004. So very often these steps are taken if there are qualified women. You know, why not? And particularly when you have other regional and other characteristics. The idea of creating a gender parity in the House, and there are other countries that have gender parity laws. Even France has at certain levels gender parity laws. This notion that these bodies should be 50-50 is something that's no longer considered very radical or strange. The question is, how do you deliver it? And the reason why I made the proposal I made was not because I expected it would necessarily be implemented, but I was trying to point out that in our system, it's very difficult for even the most well-meaning party leader to guarantee that he or she will have a caucus that's gender balanced. And that's because of our nature of our first past the post system, our plurality elections, etc. And there are some people who argue that you should have proportional representation in party lists, but even that's not a guarantee. That gives a lot of power to the party leaders themselves, as opposed to the kind of grassroots nomination processes. So when I was a member of the legislature in British Columbia, when I was elected in 1986 to the BC legislature, I was part of a two-member constituency. All the major urban ridings in BC were two members. And as it happened, there were two women elected from my riding, two different parties. But it's not unusual in Canada. We've had many situations in the Maritimes where ridings were elected two members at the provincial level. And the interesting thing in the Maritimes was that those two-member constituencies were designed to balance Protestants and Catholics. So if you were, say, the Liberal Party, you would nominate two candidates in a riding, a Catholic and a Protestant. So the people who voted for your party would get one of each. If you were Conservatives, the same thing. So this was a mechanism that was used to try and redress a balance that was considered socially very divisive. So there is history and precedent for doing this. So my suggestion was that if you made all of the ridings two-member ridings. Now that doesn't mean you're going to double the number of people in the House of Commons.
Of course.
You'd create a royal commission, and they would look at the boundaries, and they would redraw the boundaries. The House of Commons is already much bigger than it was when I was there. It was 285 members when I was there. It's now 338, I think. So at some point you say, okay, enough is enough. I mean, the American House of Representatives is capped at 415 members, so they can move boundaries, but they don't add more members, even though it is now probably twice as big as it was when that cap was set. So you create boundary drawings, and each riding would elect a man and a woman, and you could have a man's list and a woman's list. Everybody gets two votes. You vote for the man's list and the woman's list. You can vote a party ticket. You can vote, a liberal man and a conservative woman, or green man and a purple woman, whatever. The point is, that would give you automatic instant parity, and men and women would not be struggling against each other for nominations. The party leaders would not be interfering and parachuting people in, which makes the local party organizations mad. So in many ways, it's a very democratic way of doing it. Now people say to me, well, that's not democratic. Well, it is. And then people raise the question, well, what about people who don't identify as either male or female? It's too complicated. For that purpose, I think you could ask people to choose one or the other. But as I say, I'm not suggesting that I think people are going to do this, but what I'm saying is that if you wanted parity, and recognizing our political tradition where we're used to members of parliament who represent a definable geographical area, because proportional representation doesn't necessarily work that way, and so you would have the minimum amount of change for the maximum amount of impact. That was why I proposed doing that, because I don't see other ways coming. Now, Prime Minister Trudeau, when he was running in the last election, said this will be the last election when we're going to be elected by a first-past-the-post system. Well, maybe.
Maybe, that's a big change.
But proportional representation is a huge change. And even if you have single transferable ballots, what that addresses is not the gender issue. That addresses the question of whether minority parties get any kind of say in having seats, or whether, people should be able, if your candidate gets knocked off, you should have a second kick at the can. And there are very interesting philosophical arguments about it.
Of course.
And one of the things about our party system is it's designed to create big tent parties, which in many ways are very good. When you have to sit down with people of your own party who don't agree with you, it sort of sands the edges off too much ideological purity and imposes a certain kind of realism and breadth of vision in your view, because wherever you come from, believe me, there are lots of Canadians who don't think anything like you, and you need to make common cause with them in order to live together as a country. So anyway, so my proposal was really designed to be what I thought was the most effective, the least disruptive, and actually a traditionally, historically rooted approach to addressing the need to try and equalize two different groups in a legislature. So we don't need to worry about Protestants and Catholics so much anymore, but that division set the stage and set an example for something we could use today for gender parity.
Right, and of course my own question, not my own question, but a question I foresee if we were to change the electoral structure like that. People would next be asking about immigrants from certain backgrounds, or people who have been in Canada who represent a particular demographic, perhaps First Nations votes, where, not that I'm going to
Well,
put
the
some
point is that if you have geographically based representation, those communities can draw on the people in their communities. If you look at the ethnic diversity in our parliament, these are people who come from areas where their communities are well represented.
Yes.
Or where there is an interest in supporting those communities. So if you want to create a set of quotas for certain kinds of communities, this is done in some countries.
Yes.
We haven't done it in Canada. It's not impossible to do. It is something one could do in a reformed Senate if you wanted to create that, use that house for a different purpose as well. I mean, it's provincial representation, but you could perhaps identify some other things. But I mean, at some point, I think you can't be excessively formulaic.
I agree.
You have to allow communities to encourage people to come forward. But I think that, frankly, if you had gender parity, you would have a very different mood, and ideally it would be reflected in other openness. And I think that the diversity of parliamentarians grows apace in the country. So.
Yes, I agree. So, with respect to the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, of which you're the founding principal, last fall you addressed the class, and I really enjoyed listening to the, as you've touched on earlier with the Etruscan societies, the anthropological lore of leadership. And that we may have democratic instincts programmed into our adaptive psychology, that we are predisposed both to following leaders and to leading others in order to achieve common goals. And some people might be best suited in one capacity or another. So I've heard some men say that women are not properly represented in positions of power in our society because men are perhaps biologically programmed for leadership, whereas women might not be. And in spite of all the women in various movements throughout history proving their capacity, can you tell me a bit more? We've actually quite covered this under Etruscan society, but I wanted to hear more of this lore of leadership that you talked about.
Well, everybody thinks that the reality that they see at any particular given time is sort of ordained by nature.
Yes.
We are very much cultural creatures. There is no question that women bear children, and that the role of women in bearing children is fundamental. I would not for a moment like to suggest that there's no difference between men and women. And in different times of human society, the gender role differentiation took different forms. But if the goal of a society is to preserve its members, then the kinds of things that would make it possible for women to bear children and for women and children to be preserved, and for men to do what was necessary to make that happen, it's quite natural that those things would develop. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it follows from that even in those societies, women needed to be oppressed.
Right.
There's a wonderful book called it's called Primates Handbook by Robert Sapolsky. Robert Sapolsky is an American scientist who is sort of the Jane Goodall of baboons. You know, Jane Goodall watched the chimps, totally changed the way we look at animals. Animal behavior is very different now. I mean, there was a time when, you know, animal behaviorists, you couldn't give names to the animals you watched, and you had to just assume that anything they did that looked something like we would recognize as human behavior was obviously not that. It was some hormone working or something. Anyway, we have a very different view now. We've come to understand that there are many animals that are very social and have emotions and have, you know, whether it's elephants or killer whales or whatever. So anyway, Robert Sapolsky studies baboons, and he wrote a wonderful book about them. And in baboons, yes, there's a fair amount of kind of alpha male and, you know, whatever the baboons do. But he noticed in one family of baboons, one group of baboons, that there was a male who hung out with the females. And he kind of helped with the kids. And was sort of very friendly. And he noticed that this male got a lot more sex than the other non-alpha males. And he thought it was really kind of interesting that, so it wasn't just that the most ferocious of the males got a chance, you know, that fended off the other males, got to have access to the women. And I remember reading this and thinking, this is too good to be true. Because what it simply points out is that the way men and women relate to each other is very socially determined.
Yes.
And just as in the Etruscans, companionate marriage, men and women loving and respecting each other, women being free to do things and horrify the Greeks if they came to visit, that in that society, for whatever reason, unfortunately we don't know the Etruscan language, so we can't translate their writings or what their inscriptions. I think we don't know what they say. But you know, that we should not assume that something that maybe we've always seen is natural. And there are, you know, whole social structures that have grown up around this idea of strong gender differentiation, particularly with their hierarchical structures that came in, you know, when we began to settle, we went into agriculture and left our hunter-gathering ways. But society is really what we make it. And what we do know, and we live in a very interesting time, which even the Etruscans didn't have the benefit of, in that we have all sorts of research about how our brains really work. And the notion, for example, that women aren't good in math is actually wrong, and girls are now doing better than boys at math in school. That basically the human brain is incredibly flexible, and that women and men really are not so different, that there are more differences within the sexes probably than between them. So you say to yourself, what are the needs of my society? If my society needs to survive, what are the gender roles that will make that possible? Are gender roles where women have to stay home barefoot, pregnant, and chained to the sink, and where women do not get educated, and where women have to, you know, not do anything outside the home? Does that suit the survivability of my society? And I would say in this day and age of nuclear weapons and, you know, conflicting ideologies and all things, that does not serve the interest. And in fact, there are boatloads of research studies that demonstrate that the best indicator of a country's social and economic development is the status of women. So maybe there was a time in human history, or maybe there have been times in human history, where women had to play certain gender roles, where they didn't get a chance to participate because there were other factors that were more important, and it made more sense to make these differences. I don't know. I mean, I always think the men wanted to have the good parts for themselves, but even so, assuming that you argue that, that is not an argument for today,
Yes.
not having women participate. And now the difference, when I've been speaking recently about the centenaries of women's suffrage in Canada, I make the point that that was the beginning of a very important set of developments. Because today what we know is that women in legislative bodies have a very strong influence on the agenda. Different things get talked about. Women ask different questions. They do things differently. And they actually also often humanize the bodies, because when I was in Parliament, for example, we did away with night sittings. And we stopped, 1 week in 4 we didn't sit. And this made it much easier for members of Parliament to both go back to their constituencies and spend time with their families. It wasn't for women that we did this. Men and women wanted to have a more humane life in Parliament. The days when Parliament was a male club and men would stay up late all night drinking and, waiting for a vote and that kind of stuff, today's men don't really want to do that. So we now know that, Credit Suisse, all of these kind of conservative financial institutions are talking about research that shows that when you have women in senior management and women on your boards, you're more profitable. The days of people say, well, we'd love to have a lady on our board. It would be very nice to have you on our board. You'd probably wear a cute hat and be very nice and decorative. But what do we say to the shareholders? It's about the bottom line. Well, now the question is, how do you justify not having women on your board and not having women in senior management? Since it's very clear and research demonstrates that if you did, you would have higher profitability. How do you justify that to your shareholders? So because this began a process where women began to push back, and women, even under serious barriers, managed to get themselves into various places. There are enough women to be able to analyze their performance. And so the conversation is very different now. So the notion that in this day and age, the world would be a better place if women were not involved in government, I just think is bizarre. I look at somebody like Angela Merkel. Before I became leader of the party, I remember reading an article somebody wrote about, what kind of a woman could be American president? Well, she'd have to be a brunette. She couldn't be this and she couldn't be that. And I thought, that's me. I wasn't running for president. But I look at somebody now, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of Great Britain, Saatchi actually helped her to kind of spruce up her image, and she took lessons to lower her voice so it wasn't so strident, etc. She was a very attractive woman, but she was careful to dress. Now you compare her to Angela Merkel, who has a whole series of jackets in different colors and slacks that she wears. And she does color her hair. She thinks it's important for women to color their hair. She's not the least bit glamorous. I've never seen her in a skirt. And she has totally transformed our expectations of what a woman needs to look like. And I don't think anybody thinks she's a sissy or weak. You may agree with her, you may disagree with her, but she's an extremely strong leader. And incidentally, when she was elected leader of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, a number of years ago when we first became chancellor, she became leader, and I said to someone who was a very senior person in the international world, I said, the Christian Democrats in Germany have elected a woman as their leader. Germany could have a woman chancellor. How good is it? Oh, no. If the Christian Democrats, she won't be the chancellor. And I said, well, how do you figure that? Oh, no. So-and-so will be the chancellor. And I thought, I don't think so. Well, sure enough, there she is. So I guess the short answer is, res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. Women are there. QED, I make my case. We've seen their quality. Now, does that mean every woman is fit for high office or every woman should be in Parliament? No. We're like men. Not all men should be. And I remember years ago hearing, after Indira Gandhi sent the Indian Army into the Golden Temple in Amritsar in Vancouver, the big Indian community, and a man on the radio saying, oh, I used to believe in women in politics until Mrs. Gandhi, and I thought I used to believe in men in politics until the Hunt and Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump. Excuse me, I rest my case.
Yep.
So anyway, I just think that that's an untenable position to hold now. And happily, women, we no longer have to say, please, 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 please give us a chance, please, as I did when I was graduating from university. And, you know, women were not eligible for Rhodes scholarships, and if you wanted to have, you know, a fellowship, you know, well, how do we know you're not just gonna, you know, go off and have babies and waste your education and stuff? It was very difficult. And,
Yes.
it's a different world now.
Yes, I'm glad about that. So getting back to the heavily rooted condescension that women have faced, the Miss Suffragette Project posted today a quote by the former Nova Scotia Attorney General. Granted, this was in the 1890s, before women in Canada were given the vote. And this quote really resonates with me because of the condescension, and of course reading it 100 and some years later. He said women have 4 roles. First, as we've touched on, the bearing and bringing up of children, and this is the highest. Second, the creating of home and beautifying of home life. Third, to charm men and make the world pleasant, sweet, and agreeable to live in. Fourth, to be kindly and loving, to be sweet and to be cherished, to be weak and confiding, to be protected and to be the object of man's devotion. So, how did we get to this idea that...
But you see, the problem with that is that those were always idealized versions, and it just forgetting for the moment that women are capable of doing a great deal more than that. But it really ignored reality, that women were powerless, and if their husbands abandoned them, or if they drank their wages away before they got home, there was no protection for them.
Right.
A woman was very vulnerable in many ways. So this notion that, you know, we're all going to protect the dear little women, well, it didn't work out. And, you know, as Mao Zedong once said, women hold up half the sky, and the women say, yes, the heavier half. You know, women have always borne serious burdens. You know, why do I care about reproductive rights? Because for centuries, from time immemorial, if a woman was, quote, ruined by a man, a housemaid working in a fancy house like Downton Abbey, you know, if she gets impregnated by, you know, guest coming through or something, she's ruined. Her life is ruined. She winds up on the streets because she has no power, she has no control. So it's all very well to say that, but first of all, it's a terrible waste, and women have been fighting against that. I mean, even at that time, you know, this must have really angered women.
Of course.
You know, and it's not that women don't want to have children. It's not that even women don't like to make things beautiful. My husband and I both like to make things beautiful. You know, it can be a shared thing.
Yes.
But women have much more. And when they do not get an opportunity to have an education, first of all, they don't do as good a job educating their children or looking after their children's education. It's a very important thing that women who are educated will make sure that their children are educated. And that kind of a vision is a very narrow, class-based view.
Yes.
That really, even for women of those classes, left them. I mean, what did a woman do if she was a spinster, you know, in a genteel family? You know, how did she support herself? Well, maybe she could be a governess. But, you know, why couldn't she go to law school?
Right.
You know, why couldn't she be a doctor? Well, some of them did. But the men in medicine in the turn of the 20th century explicitly worked to exclude women from the medical profession because they feared that women might prefer to have female doctors. So, you know, that is, I mean, it's just, you know, it's not just condescending, it's a very self-righteous and self-satisfied and myopic view of the world. And the thing is that when women don't get to do all these, and, you know, and a lot of women have been very happy to be homemakers and done a wonderful job. And I know lots of women whose contribution to the community is not through paid work.
Of course.
You know, it's contributing in voluntary organizations and things. And in fact, it's been a big shift in how political campaigns and things are run, because we no longer have all of these middle-class women who were not working full-time, who were available to make these organizations run. But many of them can't afford to do that now. They need to work for pay.
Yes.
But when you get paid, you get respected. And that's been part of it. So, you know, it's, it isn't either or. It isn't either you, you know, have babies and make a nice house and, you know, are weak and ineffectual, or you're some kind of, you know, strident, anti-childbearing person. No, women are like men, many things.
Exactly.
And it's also true that men can be very kind and sweet and nurturing.
Yes.
And
needing protection.
and needing protection and civilized. It's the thing is that when there is gender equality, when there is an understanding of the richness of gender roles, men and women can each be all the things that they can be. Yes, men can be strong and they can be decisive and dynamic and whatever, especially if they're socialized to be that way and they get able to get away with it and nobody thinks they're bossy. But they can also be other things. And women can be kind and loving and nurturing. And they can also be strong and decisive and protecting. And when we can express all of the capacities that we have, we're much more likely to be happy and to make the maximum contribution to society.
And to achieve the idealistic, I say idealistic because we don't really know the trusting society, but that model of a partnership rather than, as in older times in our society, property in a marriage.
Yeah. As my first husband described it, he wanted a consort battleship. Go and get the world, gets the world together.
Yes. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm excited to see what else is on the horizon for the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, because you're taking young students and promoting them to their best abilities in leadership.
Well, the philosophy of the Peter Lougheed Leadership College is, because we're doing leadership training in young people before they've gone out and met their challenges, although many of them have done a lot of interesting things, but to prepare them to be self-aware,
Yes.
to understand themselves as thinkers and actors and understand the issues in society, to have the opportunity to develop skills and hopefully be able to meet challenges more effectively. And we don't know what our students will become. I'm not interested in creating clones of me. I always say, I don't care what you think, I just care that you think. But we're very excited because the students in this first Pioneer class are really enjoying it. They're really, I think, flourishing. And so we're looking forward. We're recruiting our new class of students, and we hope that over the years we'll be able to, ripple out the effect of the college. So it's really a delight to do it.
Yes. So thank you.
You're welcome.